Hello there and welcome. I'm Ulborger, and if you're new here, I really hope I'll earn your subscription today. I'm going to build some pathways, some bridges, some ladders, and some scaffolding if we're going to make a mine. And for that, we're going to use these wooden dowels. I also have some coffee stir sticks. And then we have to go to the laser cutter and make a straight track that can go all the way through here. So we better get started. I actually lost the footage of the first part that I was going to film for this video. So I have to reuse all the footage from my laser cutter from last time I cut some tracks. And that's why you see this curved one. But I actually only needed to cut 4 of these straight tracks for my railroad track into the mine. Now I just have to extend the range of this track and cut some sleepers. And for that I will use my mini table saw and some coffee stir sticks. They were cut a bit roughly, so I had to use some sandpaper to smooth everything out. I used some super glue to attach both ends of the track to one sleeper. And to make sure the spacing between the tracks was correct, I used one of my mining carts to lock in the track. I made 2 pieces of track. I wanted to run all the way through the corridor here on the mine. I'll also need to connect the 2 tracks together and trim one of them a bit, so it will match the length of the corridor. I will glue in one of the coffee stir sticks, and in the end of the longest track part I will trim down half of the track over the sleeper to make room for the short part of the track and glue it in here. And then I can just glue in all the sleepers 1 inch apart. And I think it turned out pretty good. And it fits perfectly through the corridor, and I just can't wait to get some paint on this and see how it looks. And now I'll just need to build some bridges, some walkways, and some scaffolding for the miners. And for that, I will use some of my coffee stir sticks. I always had this idea that I wanted a diagonal bridge across here, but there's a bit of the cliff in the way, so I have to dig up some of the work I did previously. It's not much I need to remove, but still I need to fix it later with some Mod Podge and paint. And for now, the bridge fits perfectly in here. Now I just need to measure out the rest of the walkways and paths and trim down the ends so they won't be rounded. I'll need some boards for the walkways and bridges, and watch it. When you cut too many layers at the same time, the tension is too high and it can fly away. Let's try that again. I just have to hold it tight. Yep, that worked. Let's cut some more. I'll glue the boards on with some super glue. It takes a while, but it's actually pretty satisfying. Everything is done, and I think it looks pretty good. But now we need to fix all the mess I made on top of this cliff. I will just seal it up with some Mod Podge mixed with black paint, and later I will paint it. I don't want to use any plaster for this repair. I'll also make some of these walkways into some scaffolding, but I want the scaffolding to follow the wall right here, so I need to cut some of it off. And for that I'll use my side cutter and try to trim everything off very slowly until I have the perfect fit for the wall. And as I mentioned, I want a second level for this. I'll also need to trim this a bit down, and then I'll need to make some room for attaching some of my wooden dowels. I'll cut up some of these 4x4mm wooden dowels and cut away a piece of board to make room for the dowel to work as a support. I use super glue to attach the dowels to the walkway and use some activator to make it cure fast. I don't use any kinds of measurements, I'm just building this from my head and how I visualize things, and then I just test fit all along the way. And it works pretty well for me, but I'm sorry, I can't give you any drawings or measurements for how to build this. and the final piece is glued in. On my finger! That was not supposed to happen, but this happens occasionally when you use a lot of superglue. And now it's done. I also built a smaller piece over here in the corner, and then it just hit me. I want my players to feel like they really are in a mine or in a cave. So I want to make a higher build for this cave, some sort of an enclosure, but I still want the playability of this because that's an essential part of all my builds, has to be playable. So how do I do that? Well, I found this piece of high density XPS foam. This is very strong and very rigid. It was quite expensive. I found it in a local architect store where they build models for architecture and stuff like that. And the thickness of this piece of foam is actually the same as all the other foam that I have used. It's 50 millimeters. So I will cut some 25 millimeter strips to build this frame. And again, I just do some measurements by the eye and see where things fits the best, and glue it together with some hot glue. And I want the frame to have the shape as the cave below, so I used my handheld to make some more cave-like cuts, and later on everything is going to be very messy. And I use all the scrap I cut off to make some pieces that will follow all the lines of the cave below. I also cut into the frame itself and not only the scrap that I had glued on. And I want this to match the cave below as closely as possible. I ran out of cut-off of the expensive foam, so I went to my scrap pile and found some of this pink foam, and it matches the size perfectly. I'm trying to make the cuts so they will lean over and make this cave form, so you feel like it's rounded over your head when you are walking there. And this is actually a new way for me to work, because I have to work with this upside down, and I have to think the opposite way as I did when I was building the bottom part of this. I will need a lot of trimming here and there, and then it's time to get messy. It's time to use some plaster. Plaster is always so messy, and I must say I really hate working with it. But it is necessary, and I think the effect is very cool when it's done, so that is actually why I do it. I spent almost 2 hours mixing up new batches of plaster, shaping, molding, filling in gaps, and I made up a huge mess, and it took a while to clean up. And again, this is one of the reasons why I try to avoid working with plaster. Still, the effect is pretty cool. And now to give it some Mod Podge mixed with black paint, just to seal everything in before I can go and prime. And I was a bit impatient because I had to put Mod Podge on both sides of this frame. So I raised it up with some coffee stir sticks just to make it easier to remove from the table when it was drying. And while I'm waiting for the Mod Podge to dry, I will use this matte black primer on top of all the edges that won't be passable in the gameplay. So I will paint it black to illustrate that you can't go here. And I actually did the same thing on the maze part of the cave and mine. And now it's time to use some primer. I used these Game Master from the Army Painter, the Dungeon Subterrane and Ruins and Cliffs. And I just mix and match it on both sides. And the cool thing about this paint is that it is foam safe. A lot of aerosol cans, the paint will melt some of the foam, or some of the additives that are in the paint will melt the foam. I don't know what it is, but it can mess things up, and we definitely don't want to do that. But this paint is actually pretty safe, and you can paint it directly on top of foam. And while the primer dries, I will start painting with this dark wood speed paint from my airbrush. All the woodwork on the tracks, the pathways, the scaffolding, I will just base coat it with this dark wood speed paint. Airbrushing is done, and I will use this dusty skull and dry brush all the parts to make them look a bit more worn out. And then we have the tracks. And for that, I will use this plate metal to make it a bit shiny. But we also need to put in some rust effects. And first, I will give it a rusty wash. And then I will dab it with this dark rust. And some fresh rust to give it some highlight. And the last thing we need is painting this frame. I'll need to give it the same color as I have done on the bottom part. I'll dry brush on the cavern base and the dungeon base, and for that I will use an old makeup brush. And to highlight everything, I will use these three colors: the dungeon highlights, the cavern highlights, and the cavern effects. And finally, we need to fix the cutout I made for the bridge. And this part is done, and I'm very excited about it. I really love that you have some dimension and depth into this cave mine, and the integrity of the gameplay is still intact. So I can just remove this, and since I painted it black, I can still tell my players that you can't go there. But let's have a closer look on how this turned out. Thank you so much for watching this video to the end. I really appreciate you being here, and if you think I've earned it, please hit that subscribe button down below. I would really appreciate that very much. Or even if you would like to give me a comment or a like. This is it for now. I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.